I remember it like it was only yesterday. I was sitting there thinking, boy, I should really film that flashback video tomorrow. Now, flashbacks, or torchbacks as they're known in the UK, are somewhat of a controversial topic. That's because when executed poorly, flashbacks can distract from the main plot of a novel. They can go on for way too long, and they just kind of take the gas out of an otherwise good story when not executed well. Or they take the petrol out of an otherwise good story. A lot of readers seem to not like flashbacks, and a lot of authors tend to really like writing them. So let's talk about some things that will elevate your flashbacks from really, really bad to really, really good. Or for my UK viewers, things that will lift your flashbacks from really, really bad to really, really good. First off, let's define what a flashback is, because depending on how you structured your novel, this can get a little bit complicated. I'm defining a flashback as any break in the linear temporal continuity of a story. Generally, for it to be a flashback, this has to go into the past. Boy, I've been waiting to say linear temporal continuity in a video forever, so I'm glad I finally was. Normally in a novel, we experience the main timeline of the character's life, even if you're writing in past tense. A flashback happens when we go further back in time to a point before the events of the novel started. Usually flashbacks involve characters who participate in the main plot of the story, but if you're going back a few hundred years or whatever, you might have flashbacks that use other characters. Flashbacks can become problematic for a few reasons. For one thing, they are a distraction. Anytime you jump back in time, the reader has to divert their attention from the story that was happening and move to a different story. This presents a few problems. If they were liking the story that they were so rudely flashbacked out of, then that's bad because you're taking them away from something they like and moving them to something that they don't know if they like or not. You also need to introduce them to a new place, a new time, potentially different characters, which means you need to do all the work of initially getting the reader into the main present day plot. You need to do that again with another plot. At their worst, flashbacks stop giving the reader what they want and give them something that they might feel they didn't ask for. So let's go over some ways to avoid that. I think the most important thing, if you want to incorporate a flashback into your novel, is to make sure it has a clear purpose and to make sure that the reader understands that purpose. There needs to be some kind of information that is revealed through the flashback that has a bearing on the main plot. Your flashbacks should serve as a vehicle to enhance the main plot of your story. Flashbacks are commonly used to exposit elements of a character's backstory, and in these situations, you want to make doubly sure that something revealed in the flashback illuminates something about how the character acts in the present. Stormlight Archive, I think, has a good example of this. Every book in that series has a lot of flashbacks that reveal how characters became who they are and go through kind of the important events of those characters' lives. And in every case, there is generally a strong connection between present day events and the events described in the flashback. Keeping flashbacks relevant to the main thrust of the story is incredibly important. If you have a long flashback that just seems like a random story and there's no visible connection to the main plot, then it risks becoming a distraction. That's when you're going to lose the reader. That's when the reader is not going to like the flashback. I think if you had to boil down what's a good flashback versus a bad flashback, it's the connection to the main plot. If you lose that, then the flashback is bad, no matter what. Also, on the character backstory note, I think that you should avoid using flashbacks as a crutch to get across characterization information. The best way to characterize, to make the reader know who a character is and how they behave and how their backstory has shaped them into who they've become, is by demonstrating these elements through the present actions of the character. Using a flashback to explain events that are used to characterize the character is always going to be a little bit of a crutch. If you're a master at characterization, you shouldn't need flashbacks. You can still use them, but just understand that, in my opinion at least, If you are 100% doing your characterization correctly, you shouldn't need a flashback to show the reader who that character is. They should be able to learn that through watching the character in the present day scenes. Another important element of flashbacks is where you incorporate them within the main plot of the story. Where do we leave the main plot and go back in time to see a flashback? Ideally, whatever is covered in the flashback should be clearly relevant to the scene that the flashback appears in. Whatever scene we cut out of to go into the flashback should have an obvious connection to the flashback. If we break from the main story to see the first time the character ate pancakes, then they should have, in the main plot, just walked into an IHOP or something, and that event triggers the memory and makes us go into the flashback. Or maybe, I guess, hopped into an IHOP. I think that's what you're supposed to do there. Tangentially related to this is making very sure that the scene we're seeing is, in fact, a flashback. There should be no confusion on the reader's part that they are, in fact, looking at a flashback. You need to be very, very clear about this. The last thing you want is any confusion about when something is happening. Starting flashbacks at a scene or chapter break is a good idea because if it happens in the middle of a scene, there's a chance the reader will miss the transition to the flashback. Another important point is I think that flashbacks should only happen once the reader has a strong connection with your story and with your characters. If you present an interesting character, an interesting plot situation early in the story, the reader is going to become curious about the events that led up to that situation. Waiting until this point to go into backstory or to go into flashbacks usually makes the flashbacks more palatable. The reader will actually be invested in learning about the character's past. This will motivate them to get past the difficulty of relearning a new story, which they have to do if you're going to go back in a flashback. I critiqued the first chapter of a novel a while ago that had, I don't even remember, about a dozen flashbacks and time jumps within the first chapter that covered all of these things in the character's backstory. And it's like, I don't even know who this character is yet, which is its own problem in chapter 1. But also, you're talking about 20 monumental moments in their life in the first page and a half in the story. I don't even know who they are. I don't even know if I like them yet. That's too much. Don't go to flashbacks too early. Flashbacks are always going to be a bit of a rug pull for the reader. You are distracting from the story. And if you do it too early, before you have trust and engagement, you risk turning them off. Early on in a novel, you need to be getting the reader comfortable. They need to learn and get familiar with the main plot and timeline that they should expect to follow. You don't want to confuse them too much or distract them or overwhelm them by introducing a whole bunch of different timelines. This brings up another really important point. Flashbacks should not take up too much of the story. They are, after all, a supplement to your main plot. They should not become the whole plot. Now, some stories are framed as one big flashback, and that's different. Heart of Darkness, or The Name of the Wind, I think also does this, where you basically have the main body of the story be a character who's recounting a really long flashback, and that's like the entire story. So arguably those novels are just one big long flashback. But in those stories, that's the point. The whole novel is centered around the flashback, and the present day is just a frame story to launch into that flashback. You also have some novels where you have multiple parallel stories that happen at different times, and it could be argued that earlier story arcs in those novels are arguably flashbacks, but they're a larger part of the plot, and therefore maybe go beyond being called a flashback and are just arcs in their own right. The one example that leaps to mind here is Holes by Louis Sachar. That story has, I think, 3 or 4 different arcs that happen in different times. There's a main arc which is happening present day, and then there's some other stories that have happened in the past at different times in different places. That's an example of a novel that has flashbacks that are long enough and large enough parts of the story to be considered their own arcs. I will also note that soccer does a really, really good job of tying all of those arcs together and making the reader understand why they are relevant to the main thread of the story. What you don't want is you don't want a situation where flashbacks are distracting from your main story. If the plot presented in your flashbacks is more interesting or seems more interesting than your main story, but it gets less attention, it's going to weaken the main plot and the novel overall. This is why keeping flashbacks short is so important. The time you spend flashbacking is time you don't spend on your main plot. And the main plot is called the main plot for a reason. Keeping flashbacks short avoids a lot of the problems that we've talked about, especially if the reader isn't 100% interested in them, or they're 100% interested in your main plot and they want to get back to it. Not spending a huge amount of time on flashbacks is something that's really important. Speaking of not spending too much time on something, I'm going to not spend too much more time on this video because we're at the end of it. So there you have it. If there are any flashbacks from novels that you fondly remember, please tell me about them in the comments down below. If you want to see more stuff like this, you can check out all my other videos and subscribe to my channel. As always, thanks for watching, and I will see you next time.